Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I leave the library and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I'm on my walk home from dropping off some books at the library and thought I would talk to you a little bit about books. I was looking, and it has been nearly 2 months since I did a book Roundup episode. Now, normally I try to do these every 3, but I did the last one kind of late. So I thought I would do this a little bit earlier. That's right, it's time for Book Roundup for Q2 of 2024. For those of you new to this kind of episode, this is going to be mostly focused on the reading I've been doing recently. And so if you don't want to talk books with me, maybe this isn't the best episode to listen to. On the other hand, I will also talk about games a little bit, think about one game that fits the theme or the idea of the book, and if I can, and mention that as well. So there's still something to get out of it for my game-focused friends, but mostly we're going to be talking books today. Well, as I said, I divide my reading up by quarter, so I do keep track on Goodreads if you want to find me there. The easiest way to do that is just to go to the Rattlebox Games show page for this episode, and you'll find links to my Goodreads there, and you can follow me there. But I do keep track of my reading on Goodreads, and I tag each book that I read with a quarter as well as the year. So like all the books I'll be talking about here are tagged 2024-Q2 because they're in Q2. That's part of how I keep track. At the end of the year, I delete all of the quarter tags and just have everything under the year. But for the purposes of this podcast especially, it's really nice to organize things that way. I'll have 9 books that I read in Q2. I don't have time to talk about 9 on the podcast. I usually get 4 or 5 discussed, so I'm going to aim for that, and I'll just mention the other ones if I can. So let's just jump right in. These are not in chronological order, but rather in the order of books I'm most interested to tell you about. The first one is The Toll by Sherry Priest. Now, Sherry Priest is a really interesting writer. I've read some of her stuff, but not very much. But she's written a lot, and I think she's pretty good. She writes in the horror space and steampunk. This book in particular is very much sort of gothic horror or southern gothic horror. The premise is there's a town, and on your way to the town from one part of, I think the town's in Louisiana. It could be in North Florida maybe, or southern Georgia. It's somewhere in there. If you're on your way to the town from this one direction, you'll go over 6 bridges. If you ever find a 7th bridge, you're in trouble. That's kind of the idea, and going over the bridge has a toll. I don't want to tell you too much more about it except that it's a Lovecraftian supernatural story with some really interesting writerly turns in it. There's one moment in particular that I found very compelling, and I'm going to share that now for about a minute. So if you don't want to hear a twist in the story that I don't think is a huge plot point, but it is a plot point, turn away now. So there is this moment in the book that's really fascinating. This character goes into a room, and he realizes the room is full of ghosts. And at first you're thinking, oh, maybe he means memories, but no, there's actually ghosts in there. And the author, Sherry Priest, nonchalantly reveals that ghosts are visible in this town. People know who they are. They see them every day. They're just like people who live in the town, only they're ghosts. And we have characters that we've met thus far in the story that it turns out are ghosts. And we didn't know they were ghosts because the book didn't tell us that. But now we're learning that in the reflection there. It's a clever, a really masterful turn of writing that makes for a very compelling moment in the book about halfway through. I don't think that ruins anything for you. I think the book is good enough to stand on its own, but it's such a really compelling moment in the book. I had to stop and go back and reread it just to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Now, of course, this book, like I said, has this sort of Lovecraftian elements. Clearly, this is very suited for an Arkham Horror style story. The main characters, the way they interact with the world, the stuff going on, it's all very compelling, and I think would make for an excellent scenario or campaign in Arkham Horror, the card game. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to make a fan-made scenario built on that story. I'll have to think about that. But yeah, that's The Toll by Sherry Priest. Next up, I want to talk about The Word is Murder. Anthony Horowitz is a very well-known screenwriter and novelist who's written tons of books. And he has this book called The Word is Murder that's essentially like his take on the Sherlock Holmes mythos. In the book, he plays the Dr. Watson character, but he's writing as if it's himself. He's writing, signing it as Anthony Horowitz. He's writing about stuff that quote unquote happened to him. And this genius detective who's sort of socially inept or socially antagonistic to most people, who he's working with, but he doesn't really like him all that much. It's very compelling, really interesting writing, very thoughtful as a modern take on Sherlock Holmes without ever mentioning that that's what it is. And I understand there's more of them. I think I'm going to read more of them because I really liked it. So if you think that sounds interesting to you, you should check out The Word is Murder by Anthony Horowitz. Of course, if you're going to play that, you should probably play Watson and Holmes, the competitive mystery game. I would suggest that one as the accompaniment or the version of this that you might encounter, because Watson and Holmes is a little bit antagonistic as a game. You are competing with other mystery solvers to try to solve the mystery first, and Horowitz and his detective character, I don't remember the name of the character, are having an interesting conflict or contradiction between them, and so that fits the process better than something like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. So if you get a chance, The Word is Murder. It's an excellent book. Recommended. Next up we have Geek Love. Geek Love was written by Catherine Dunn, and it is, I guess it's a book I encountered in a number of places, and I kept seeing it, so I thought it must be good because it kept coming across my transom or getting recommended. And it is good, but it's really strange. I'm not sure if I liked it or not. It was very compelling, but I'm not sure that's the same. The premise is, it's a double storyline in which we have one narrator in two parts of her life. We have the narrator or the main character when she is a child or a teen, and the narrator when she is an adult or an older adult, like in her 60s or 50s. And the idea is that in both cases we are learning this story of her and her family. Her family is a group of people who own a circus. At the center part of their circus is what we classically would call a freak show, or a big part of it is these performers who are showing off physical abnormalities and doing so to the delight of paying customers. It's a traveling carnival that goes from town to town in this caravan of trucks. And part of the premise is that the family that runs it are people who have these physical differences that are caused by intentional manipulation of the fetuses by the father while they're in utero. It's really messed up, and there's a number of things in this book that are just really grotesque, both from a physical description standpoint, but also from a ethical, moral standpoint or character development standpoint. It's a really disturbing book in some ways, but very compelling, really well written, very thoughtful about how people engage with the world, and as such, pretty interesting and compelling enough that I definitely wanted to finish it, and I found myself intrigued all the way through. But again, I don't know if I liked it. Definitely worth checking out. It's won awards and stuff, so it's very well written. That's Geek Love. And of course, as I think about two games that could thematically connect with reading Geek Love, on the one hand, I think of The Bloody Inn, which sort of features a horrifying family, and there's an expansion for it, which I have but have not played, called The Carnies. So The Bloody Inn, The Carnies feels like one approach, not very thoughtful or helpful to circus folk in terms of stereotypes. And then the other one, of course, is The Magnificent, the Christian Amon Osby game about running a circus and attracting people and stuff. That game is really good, very interesting. I have an expansion for that one as well that I have not played. So the two things mixed together really are compelling and interesting. So that's The Magnificent and The Bloody Inn with the Carnies expansion as a follow-up to Geek Love by Catherine Dunn. Next up, I read Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books by Kirsten Miller. Now this is a book about a town fighting over book banning and the idea of how education shapes people. It is a mix of really compelling character work. Kirsten Miller is a very strong writer of particularly villains in the nature of the kind of most odious Stephen King or J.K. Rowling villains, but also a really thoughtful approach to the question of how should communities heal from these kinds of attacks and ill wishes. So it's a book that speaks to this moment right now. I would say it also feels a bit utopian or almost naive in its resolution of these issues. It feels a little too pat. It can feel nice to have this kind of experience, but it also just is a little disheartening to think, could it really work this way? Could it really be this way? So that's Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books. I did also in Q2 read 2 different Charles Stross Laundry Files books. I read The Annihilation Score and Nightmare Stacks. I really liked The Annihilation Score. It was a strong outing from Stross. I thought that the introduction of the internal character of the demon in the white violin was very strong, and having a book from Mo's perspective, Mo being Maureen, being the wife of the Laundry Files main character, Bob, up to that point, I thought that Mo really brought a fresh perspective to it. And I think that that is the continuing process from here on out. I think Stross is taking other people's perspectives for the next few books. I don't know if he ever goes back to Bob Howard or not. Again, these are books about being investigators and Lovecraftian things. I would think the game that would go this is not Arkham Horror, because in that game you are not official, your private eyes or your interested citizens, academics and whatnot. Instead, I would point to the Bureau of Investigation, or Bureau of Paranormal Investigation. I can't remember exactly what it's called. The Sherlock Holmes consulting detective spinoff that sort of branches into Mythos Tales territory by creating grotesque Lovecraft-inspired stories in the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective style. It's pretty good. I liked it. Not as good as Consulting Detective. So I would caution you on that. Also, not as much bang for your buck in terms of the mysteries. You only get 5 mysteries in the box instead of the 10 that you get for the most Sherlock Holmes boxes. Nonetheless, pretty entertaining and a really good way to think about something like the Laundry Files books. I will say I also really did like the Nightmare Stacks, which involves another character entirely. It makes me think that the future books are going to involve different characters each time. That is The Annihilation Score and Nightmare Stacks. All right, I do have 1, 2, 3 more books I wanted to mention that I did read, but I won't have time to talk about in depth. I read Going Infinite by Michael Lewis. This is a short book kind of painting a picture of the rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried, who ran ATX, the largest cryptocurrency trading house in the world, and ended up going to jail for fraud. Part of what's really interesting that Michael Lewis has revealed is that it looks like there really wasn't much fraud. He was very sloppy in his management of the finances, but the company, the receivership company that came in to take over the company after they declared bankruptcy, was looking for something like $13 billion of missing assets. And as of the writing of book, they found almost all of it. That none of it was stolen. It was all just like kind of laying around in different bank accounts and stuff. It hadn't been properly tracked, but it doesn't look like most of it was stolen. Some of it was hundreds of millions of dollars, so it's not nothing. But really interesting book. Just because Michael Lewis wrote it though. Like, I don't find Sam Bankman-Fried particularly interesting. I found him obnoxious, and the people who enabled him obnoxious, and really speaks to the way that money circulates in our culture, which I don't like. So I'm not sure I'd recommend that one. If you haven't read any Michael Lewis, go read The Big Short. It's much better. Or The Fifth, what's it called? The Fifth Risk. That one's really good. All right, 2 more. I read a graphic novel called Star-Crossed by Jerry Frizen. I did not catch the name of the artist. Apologies. Star-Crossed is a story about first contact and one of the alien conversationalists and one of the human conversationalists, and a budding love story between them. And finally, Dr. Olaf von Schuler's Brain by Kirsten Menger Anderson. This is a short story collection themed around a family where each story is another generation of the family and their various intrigues into the study of medicine, particularly the study of the brain, and the weird places they find themselves in. It was well written. because the short stories were all disconnected, I found it really hard to be compelling, and it took me a very long time to read. I put it down a couple times. I suspect if I go back and look at when I read the first page of it, it probably took me a year to read. And it's not that long. It was an off again, on again book. But because it's a series of short stories, wasn't that hard. So dear listeners, what have you been reading lately? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share your reading lists there. I'd love to befriend you on Goodreads, and we can talk books there. And I'd like to know what games you think go with the books that you've read. If you want to reach out to me, you can send me a direct message on Board Game Geek. Wombat929 is my username. Or you can send me an email, brendan@radamoxgames.com. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.